Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Does Gabby have bruises on her back? 70% of folks I polled on YouTube believe they're seeing bruises on Gabby's back. On the original channel where I saw this, I couldn't find a single comment expressing any doubt about this. I've said this before, that true crime provides a valuable insight into a larger world. It asks us, what is reality, and tests our ability to discern, to judge, to evaluate information as individuals, but also collectively as a community. How we do in these tests provides some indication for how well we're equipped to deal with our own lives, our own realities, our own situations. Are we able to cope with ordinary, everyday conundrums in everyday life? And perhaps also difficult issues. How well are we equipped to see all the complexity in order to deal with it, see it for what it is? If you can see reality, then you're better able to deal with it, respond to it, or adapt to it. In nature, an animal like an antelope that can't actually see reality, can't see a predator somewhere in the woods around it, in the undergrowth, that is lulled into a false sense of security, well, that antelope is likely to become prey. In our lives, the predator is information. It is, are we able to determine authentic information from the inauthentic, proper information, proper data from misinformation? And you might not think that that can do you any harm, but of course it can. You can choose the wrong political candidate. You can take the wrong financial decisions based on the information you have. You can click on a link that you shouldn't have and incur a loss. It's also how we deal with other people. Are we able to see the reality, see through people to who they really are? So right now, before we get started with this episode, I want you to physically put your hand up and acknowledge to yourself if the answer is yes to the following three questions. 1. Do you think Gabby has bruises on her back? 2. Do you think the most recent sighting by Dennis Davis on the Appalachian Trail was of Brian Laundrie? If you think so, put up your hand. 3. Do you believe Brian's hand was seen in the flower bed of his parents' home, in his parents' garden? If you think so, put up your hand. And now just leave a number in the comments if you answered yes once, twice, or thrice. At the end of this episode, we'll be asking the same three questions again, and let's see if we get a different answer.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
But before we get to the question of bruises on Gabby's back, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Also, later today I'll be putting up another video dealing with the crime scene and also dealing specifically with the issue of whether Gabby's remains were left out in the open or not. So look out for that in the next episode. If you find this episode interesting, please like, share, or leave a comment. And let's get started. So on the first question, the bruises on Gabby's back, those bruises are dune sand. Now have a look at this. Does Brian have bruises all over his legs, arms, and chest? Or is that sunburn? Or did he burn himself sitting beside a campfire? Or is that fine dune sand sticking to damp, perspiring skin? And have a look at this image of the type of fine, darkish sand below the sandboard. Can you see that? Now, how come in this image of Gabby, likely taken before she did any surfing, her back appears fine? And if you were bruised on your back, why would you turn your back to the camera to show them if you're trying to sell a happy, fun, enviable summer epic? Also, if your abuser was behind the camera, why would he record it and post it or allow it to be posted on social media for everyone to see? Incidentally, here's a closer shot of the sand. These are Nicole Kessinger's legs, Chris Watts' former mistress, when they were out at the Great Sand Dunes 2 years earlier. Now I can go into even further detail. We could look at Gabby's social media and look at other images, including 2 weeks later, where she's photographed in a bath and basically also kind of got her back turned. You can kind of see her shoulder. Any evidence there? Also, during the Moab sighting, she kind of has her back turned to the officer, and there's absolutely no evidence of any of that bruising there, and certainly nothing that they mentioned in their report. But does anyone go and check that, or do they just focus in that one particular screen grab absolutely in isolation? In other words, do you make your reality based on a fragment of information? You don't want to connect it to something else. You don't try to connect it to something else, because to do so would potentially disprove your hypothesis. And I do think there's a lot of fragmented thinking in the world which allows this fragmented approach where you can suddenly conjure something out of nothing. You can conjure a particular reality that's disconnected from everything else. But real reality, authentic reality, is connected. It's connected to how people behave. It's connected to the movement of time. It's connected to other things, right? That brings us to number 2. There's only been one likely sighting of Brian Laundrie, and that was before he went missing. So put in other words, none of the so-called sightings during the time period where Brian was a fugitive are legitimate. And so the question is, how many of those sightings did you go and look at? Now, I'm not saying don't go and look at them. Just think critically every time you do look at them, especially based on where we are now. Are we going to look at another 10, 20, 30 sightings, and each time, every single time go, wow, I wonder if this could be a legitimate sighting, right? Are you being misled? Are you being cynically misled? So, as I say, I think there's only been one likely sighting of Brian, and that was before he went missing. Have you been convinced that any of the sightings beyond the Fort DeSoto Park were legitimate? Were there any that you thought that could really be Brian? Are there any that you think right now could have been Brian? Now, there's a YouTube channel, I'm not going to mention its name, but it's about twice as popular as mine, and has made 17 videos in the last 3 weeks about sightings. In other words, 17 videos that basically focus on sightings, on different sightings. And it's actually even more if you include the apparent sighting of Brian Laundrie's hand in the flower bed, but we'll get to that in a moment. In those videos, the word sighting appears prominently in the title or the title image. It's emphasized. It's really meant to draw your attention, right? The word sighting either appears on the video title card or on the title text below the video, or both. Now, 17 videos about sightings in 3 weeks, or 17 videos in 21 days, is almost one video per day. Most of these videos have well over 200,000 views. Looking back 3 weeks later, how many of those 17 sightings do you think are authentic? How many of those 17 sightings do you think law enforcement really has been useful to law enforcement? Now, obviously, in the time period of the investigation dealing with the campsite, there were sightings of Brian at the campsite by people, some of it reinforced with video footage, some of it reinforced by the people who made those sightings appearing on TikTok, right? And so this is a little bit different. We knew Brian was in that area, right? And there were other people in that area as well. Now we don't know where Brian is, and people are speculating that he could basically be anywhere. So ironically, the only sighting that to me appears to be credible is the one in the DeSoto camp before Brian went missing, this one. We know from several sources that Brian was there at the time, just like at the Spade Creek camp at that time. So there's a decent chance that this was Brian. This is also the one and only sighting I've covered on my channel. I haven't covered any others. So what about these 16 other so-called sightings? Is Brian in Canada? Is he on the Appalachian Trail? How about the Laundrie's back garden? Now, because we don't know where he is, and because he's the most wanted man in America, and because there's a thirst for information, there's a demand to know something that we don't know, it's easy to suggest an easy solution to a difficult question. And each time someone does it, the hordes flock to it. And then someone does it again, and the hordes flock to that. And again, and again, and again. What I find particularly concerning with cognitive bias is you'd think it's bad enough if one person can't see the woods for the trees. But when more people are fooled, hundreds of thousands, it seems to fool even more people. In other words, when a whole bunch of people are fooled, it seems to be easier to fool another person. And in other words, when a lot of people are fooled, it's easier to fool a lot more people. Fooling people, even in the true crime community, sometimes feels easier than falling over your own feet. But why is that? Isn't the true crime community supposed to be careful, meticulous, able to pay attention to detail, cautious, circumspect, aware of subtleties, particularly aware of tricks and deceptions because you're dealing with criminals all the time? Some of the obvious reasons we see what we want to see isn't because of anything to do with good eyesight or intelligence or even common sense, although I think common sense does play a role. But things that play sometimes a bigger role are emotions, social pressure, heuristics, as well as some of our beliefs or motivations. In other words, the surrounding narrative. Someone sets up a surrounding narrative and then you kind of get led by the hand into it, believing everything you see. So some of these things may be the reason we see what we want to see. For example, if you've been abused, you probably want to see obvious signs in a case like this because it reinforces your position. You feel justified. You feel validated. You feel like your concerns are being addressed. But wanting to see something in a particular instance, wanting to see something, doesn't mean what you're wanting to see is there. The fact that you see it is there is totally different than if it is there. It doesn't mean it's true. So over the weekend, I visited a mall in South Africa and I saw a guy who I thought basically resembled Brian. His head was completely shaven. He had a black beard around his jaw and chin. Just basically the guy that was sitting there, I thought, wow, he looks a bit like Brian. He was sitting at a table eating with a female companion, completely in the open. And listening now, you may be curious about what I saw. But if I thought it looked like Brian, but knew it wasn't, and showed it to you anyway, what would that say about my discernment? If I show you what looks like bruises in one photo, but other photos don't show any bruises, and there are photos of Brian showing why this discoloration exists, then what are we doing? What are we doing when we're saying, look at this fragment, could these be bruises, when there are other pictures that show something else? What are we doing when we take out this fragment kind of out of context? I mean, if you paid attention, this person that I thought resembled Brian was in a mall in South Africa. Well, what on earth would he be doing here? You know, it's not believable. It's not credible. It's not reasonable. But if I left that part out and just said, I saw Brian at a mall, and left you to make the common sense sort of question, well, which mall where? Right? Is it a mall in Florida, or, you know, is it a mall in America? Is it a mall in Mexico? Where? So what we're playing with is cognitive bias. You know there's a strong indication of abuse, but you want to see it. You know Brian is out there somewhere, but you want to see where. And so you do, because you want to see something, you do see something, and it's obviously facilitated by certain people providing this wish fulfillment, this relief, over and over and over again. Oh, do you want to see something? Well, let me show it to you. But is it reality? And that brings us to the third and final thing, the hand. People have speculated that Brian's hand is coming out of the flower bed. Now, you may be surprised to hear this isn't even the most ridiculous conspiracy theory out there. There are others doing the rounds that this case is part of a huge conspiracy to distract people from the events of September 11. I'm not sure how the details go, but I suspect they think that Gabby and Brian and a host of other people are all actors. If that's your cognitive bias, good luck dealing with real problems in your own lives, really. There's another one that is suggesting that Brian's a serial killer. And I don't think it's enough just to dismiss these things. I think we've got to look at what is going on here. And what is going on is a need to exaggerate things, both from, to some extent, the creators on YouTube, the people making this content, and also some of the consumers. You'll also look at some of their comments and some of the things some people are saying or suggesting. There's kind of a need to exaggerate, right? And so what is going on when someone is wanting to exaggerate? They may not know that they're wanting to exaggerate, but that is what they're doing, to make reality seem worse. And some of us exaggerate to make reality seem better. Some of us exaggerate about our ailments or illnesses or our concerns. Some of us exaggerate that we are better people than we really are, or more attractive than we really are. It's something that a lot of people do. But what is going on there? Some people embellish a little here and there. Others embellish a lot all the time. And to the extent that you embellish a little or a lot is a indication of how honest you are, I guess, towards yourself, towards the world, of the world. Right? And so obviously there are some YouTube channels that do the same. So for my part, the truth, sincerely sought, truly going after the facts, the true situation, it's actually a slippery creature and is often stranger than fiction. The truth is interesting, compelling, and the moment you think it's dull, it surprises you by becoming something else. The difference with things that aren't true is that they can be spectacularly incredible. Of course, it doesn't link up to anything else, but seen in isolation can be this vivid, incredible, terrifying possibility. But then invariably it falls apart and nothing comes of it. And just as information that isn't true is relative to the reality surrounding it, truth is also relative to its own truth, if that makes sense. It depends where you're standing in time and also place. It also depends on who you are. Reality is a constant in comparison to truth. Reality is a little bit different to truth in that it is a constant that we're always trying to catch up to. And many of us don't even try because reality can be daunting. So one way to think of it is everyone has their own truth. Everyone has something that is true for them. If you were that person, you would see something exactly the same way. If you were in that person's lived experience, you would share in their emotional reality. But reality is something that is constant regardless of who you are or what your truth is. Reality is reality. Does that make sense? I want to conclude by bringing up this idea of exaggeration. A better word for it is hyperbole. It's a word that basically means excess. Isn't it completely appropriate in a world so filled with excess? Just think about social media, the excess that is sort of the currency of social media. Look how excessively happy we are. Look how excessively wonderful everything is. Look at this excessively beautiful plate of food, and on and on and on and on, right? Look at me on holiday here, on holiday there, kind of, and so on and so on. It's all about excess. It's about excess stuff, excess wants, excess needs. And what is going on is that doesn't all of this excess mean that our minds want everything to be excessive too? It's not enough that our perpetrator murdered Gabby. He's also got to be a serial killer. It's not enough that this crime happened. There has to be some kind of 007 operation to distract the nation, some kind of huge thing going on with a lot of intrigue, right? Something very, very high stakes going on. It's not enough that there was emotional abuse. There's got to be more, and we've got to see it. It's got to be these big bruises all over. But reality doesn't work that way. Reality tends to be understated and yet self-evident. Often you don't need to sell reality. Reality is simply, you can see what it is. So I have a question for creators. In true crime, are we interested in what's technically, scientifically true, or are we only interested in the effect on the audience? And for the audience, are we interested in exaggerating the wounds of the victim in order to magnify the badness of the perpetrator? Do we want to make the perpetrator worse than he actually is? At the same time, are we interested in minimizing positive traits in the perpetrator and any negative traits in the victim? In other words, are we okay with distorting things if it makes us feel better, if it makes us feel justified? All of this may give us the ego satisfaction and relief from our own inattentions, but is it reality? This relief may feel good, but doesn't it really propel us into the next impasse? And doesn't it allow us to feel like self-righteous victims for being wrong so much, for living in a world that's so unfair and so difficult and so intimidating and so frightening, rather than the alternative? Well, what's the alternative? Well, according to an article in Psychology Today, quote, exaggeration in the course of conflict resolution leads to a fortress mentality, end quote. What does that mean? In other words, people who are prone to exaggeration are also susceptible to failing to pursue the scout mindset. And I've said before, especially in the Summer Wells case, that we must have a scout mindset in terms of being open to new information, being in a process of getting information, and almost a position of saying, I don't know what the answer is, I'm going to educate myself, I'm going to learn, I'm going to gather information. Not, I know the answer and I'm going to defend it. Even when you have a situation where you can't possibly know the answer because nobody does. Nobody knows where Brian Laundrie is right now. Nobody knows where Summer Wells is right now. And so some people decide that they do know, and then they defend these exaggerated positions by even more exaggeration, by digging in, by entrenching their position more and more. So what is the alternative to this? Well, it's through being authentic about reality, that the reality of others, so the reality that belongs to other people, as well as our own reality, that we are able to gain agency in terms of these realities, these respective realities. If we can be authentic about reality, about my reality and about your reality, then we gain agency over ourselves, over the world, to some extent over one another. Seeing everything as worse than it really is another way of seeing ourselves as victims of a scary, threatening world, when it may not be as scary or threatening as we are trying to portray it. That's not reality either. So here are those same 3 questions I asked in the beginning. Please leave the number of times you raised your hand in the comments now. 1. Do you think Gabby has bruises on her back? 2. Do you think the most recent sighting by Dennis Davis on the Appalachian Trail was Brian? 3. Do you believe Brian's hand was in the flower bed of his parents' home? I want to conclude by making one final note from Psychology Today regarding the term catastrophizing, which comes from the word catastrophe, but it's basically turning a scenario into its worst possible iteration, right? And that is associated with what we do when we habitually jump to radical conclusions based on our own anxiety. And I do wonder whether that happened in this scenario with Gabby, that somebody jumped to a radical conclusion based on their anxiety, not based on the situation, not based on the reality. So this is a quote from Psychology Today. It comes from a professor of psychology at the University of Denver. His name's Dr. Michael Carson, or I guess Professor Michael Carson. And he wrote the following, quote, when someone feels anxiety and thinks he's having a stroke, or when a lover is late for lunch and the partner thinks their relationship is over, that's catastrophizing. Cognitive behavior therapists reduce the emotional level by questioning the accuracy of the catastrophic thought. Now, can you see how it's this overstimulated emotional level that is leading to this? So in other words, part of it is anxiety, but something else is some other emotion that is driving the anxiety. And it's because of the emotions that you're not able to see something for what it really is. In other words, you're not able to apportion, to allocate, to distribute, to assign, to share out the right amount of concern about something. You're not able to know what is the appropriate amount of concern, attention, resources to a particular thing. And if you think that this is, well, I'm not quite sure how relevant this is to me, well, think of the coronavirus pandemic. Governments all over the world have had to decide how much care and concern and caution to apportion to a particular state of events based on infection levels, changing infection levels. And so are you going to be at lockdown level A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4? Well, it's got to be something matching reality. And so it's important to know what the reality is and not to be basing your decisions either on alarmism or a lack of care or concern or being overcautious. In other words, you want to be appropriately cautious. You don't want your cognitive bias to get in the way of reality. You want to be realistic. So Professor Carson goes on to say, quote, many catastrophic thoughts are not merely errors in thinking. They are often efforts to wake oneself up to the fact that one needs more friends, more satisfying work, or more meaningful pastimes. So that is another way of changing the way that we might be thinking in a too anxious way. Perhaps you're too often alone with your own thoughts. Perhaps your work is giving you anxiety. Perhaps you're not doing a lot of meaningful things, so there's an emptiness in you and you're trying to find meaning in drama, right? He goes on to say, when you find yourself exaggerating, it's often a good idea instead to focus on the actual conflict and address it. So in other words, come out of the trees and look at the woods and look at what is going on and try and address that. In other words, what is the reason for your anxiety instead of looking at what is your reaction to it. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I hope you're going to continue to apply critical thinking, not only in this case, but in true crime in general, to other true crime channels, to other channels covering, for example, the Gabby Petito case, but then also in your own life. Try and think about this as you go through your day to day. How realistic are you about how you're reacting to something? Is it appropriate? And also somebody else. Are you living in reality, or are you just living in the cognitive bias of your truth, which is your interpretation of reality, and is that interpretation valid? Or are you robbing yourself of your own agency? Are you allowing someone else to rob you of your own agency? In the next episode, we'll be dealing with the crime scene, and that's definitely an area where we really need to apply our critical thinking skills and turn our perception up to a very high level, right? We need to be able to imagine something as it really is. We need to be intuitive, but realistically intuitive. Can we be? So the next episode focuses on the 6 critical clues pointing to the operative criminal psychology. Look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.